Well, pretty amazing day of presentations, I must say. I always like to have the last word because it does a couple of neat things. One, it gives you an alibi for not being original, because you can pretend that people stole your lines all day, and that does happen sometimes. But it also gives you a chance to sort of plagiarize the best ideas and pick up things that matter and mull over them a little bit before you have to kind of give a little closing. I want to talk to you for a second about the symposium itself, and the first thing that I have to do is I have to say again a shout out, a thank you to the incredible sponsors and partners and participants. We got so much support from our national sponsors and friends, but also regional and local participants and people that helped us and supported us this time. And UNLV, the students really stepped up this time. We had a lot of volunteers. We had a lot of people with great passion who got involved. And I was so amazed this morning when Javon provided us with that incredible, energetic kickoff. I'm still reeling from that. The symposium itself is in a flux. When I originally proposed the idea of the symposium to the Green Builder media team 4 years ago, part of the reason that we scheduled it up to this point on the day before the Design and Construction Week show opens is because we wanted to harvest attendance. We wanted to harvest the energy from the residential building sector. We knew that some of the great minds and the great practitioners, the manufacturers, the innovators, the advocates for sustainability and green building, but also the national real estate press would have access to our symposium if we co-located, if you will, and if we scheduled it at this point in time. But we feel like we've been around that track now 4 laps. And so going forward, frankly, we're not sure if we'll do another symposium next year, but if we do, we have decided that it won't be in conjunction with Design and Construction Week. At least we don't think so. And the reason I'm bringing it up is that if you come up with an idea, a thought, a suggestion about a location, about a time, about how we could partner with other organizations in the sustainability arena, or whatever it might be, I hope you'll feel free to contact us. And you'll make that suggestion and have a dialogue with us, because we've enjoyed, I think, a reasonable success with the symposium, and I think that it has mattered. And at the end of the day, that's what really counts. But I think we could do more. I think we could do better. I got to give a shout out to the Green Builder team too, and especially to Sarah. I know the hours, the days and weeks of effort that went into the organization of this little event, and it's incredible. And my my heart is full for the whole team. So now I get to plagiarize a little bit. I had so much fun listening to the speakers, and of course it made me think about things. You know, you always relate ideas that you hear to your own experience and to your own thinking and your own desires. And so, you know, it's kind of funny. I'll be, if you're lucky, the last gray-haired white guy that quotes Dr. King today that you have to listen to. But I do want to quote Dr. King, who said that if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. And it's time for the symposium to move forward, and I'm happy with that, and I'm at peace with that. There was something that Andrew said this morning, too, that I wanted to mention. There was a little line that just slipped by on one of his slides where the quote said that companies can't afford to be bystanders. Well, in my little pocket calendar that I carry around, I have scrawled a little phrase that I remind myself of from time to time that says, the saddest person in the world is a bystander. And so I would layer that on to the thought that Andrew shared with us. And I would say that that's what we all have to do. We have to find a way to transcend that and to be participants. We may not be the sword, we may not be the heroes, but damn it, we can be in the game. We can matter. Kalpana, and then later Rihanna, mentioned to us that it's not just what we build, but how we build. And I think that that message could not be more important today or any day. It's something that we all need to carry with us at all times. And then Gene, and I love Gene. I love his quiet strength and wisdom, pointed out that options are not the way to change. You have to set a higher standard. And it reminded me that sometimes I poke fun at the mainstream building industry and I say, if it was up to mainstream home builders, indoor plumbing would be an option. And sadly, there are jurisdictions in the United States of America where that's actually true. And we got to find a way to raise that standard a little bit, because that's not good enough for anybody. He also mentioned something about the business plan, being the smart guy in the room. The smartest guy in the room is the business plan. And I love that. I love that metaphor. But I would suggest to you that it's also important personally to stake out your place in the room. And I always like to be the dumbest guy in the room, because that means that I've got a good chance of learning something important. The other thing that Rihanna said that I wrote down, I think is really critical too. And that is that not too long from now, we're going to be somebody's ancestors. That's a big load. What will that legacy look like? I'm fearful, but I'm also hopeful. You know, Ed said, how do we get out of this mess? And I'm reminded of the two greatest political satirists in the history of the United States. From the 1900s, Will Rogers, and from the 1800s, Mark Twain. And Rogers, I love to quote Rogers. I guess I just want to be a cowboy, but Will Rogers, says things like, I don't make jokes, I just report on the government. He said, if stupidity got us into this mess, why can't it get us out of it? And there's a dozen of them that I could give you. But the point is that it's really going to be up to us, and we have to keep a sense of humor about it and not take ourselves too seriously in that process. I'm reminded a little bit of my own history, and I hope you indulge me for a minute on a couple of very personal points. In the late 70s, I was an undergrad studying architecture, and I started a construction firm at the same time, and I was remodeling apartment buildings with cockroaches the size of sea turtles, and I was just doing some really rough jobs, tough stuff, and but things got better, and I was getting sweeter jobs, and was actually getting a chance to do some design work, even though I was still an undergrad, and frankly, I think I was doing better projects than a lot of the people that were on the faculty at the school, but that's beside the point, I guess. So I decided that I wanted to do both. I wanted to design and I wanted to build, and I'm actually more of a builder and always have been. I love to design. Our place is covered with little scraps of sketches and doodlings. But I also realized that I really didn't want to work for architects. I wanted them to work for me. So in 1983, I had enough experience as a superintendent to test for my own license, and I was successful in gaining a general contractor's license, which I still hold today. And very proudly, after all these years, I'm still licensed to build anything but airports and hospitals, even though I don't build for clients anymore. But in those early days, I realized that there were a lot of things that I still had to learn. And I was a carpenter. I was always a carpenter. But I knew that I needed to do some production framing. So I took my guys and we signed on with a production builder, a volume builder that had a big subdivision going in our market. And we had never done production framing. But we looked at what was going on and muddled our way through the first handful of projects that we got hold of. And one of the things that I remember, and framers are a different breed. I mean, these are typically big, rugged guys in cut-off Levi's and sleeveless shirts and work boots, and they got, big knuckles, and they'll step out front to settle their differences, and they're just a pretty rough crowd. And I remember that the normal thing and anybody that's been on a framing site anytime will attest to the fact that, above the whirring and screeching of the saws and the noise of the compressor and the nail guns and the whacking of hammers, the main identifier is a boom box with classic rock cranking out at 128 decibels, and in the course of a work day, you get to hear Stairway to Heaven and Freebird about 10 times. And I guess it's, that's how you juice energy. But I knew we weren't going to be production framers or anything close to that for any length of time, but we wanted the experience. And so I remember hearing over and over again on neighboring pads, neighboring slabs, some foreman yelling at his crew, urging them on to hurry up by saying, "We ain't building pianos here." And I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. And so one day we were framing away, and one of my guys kind of jokingly said, "We ain't building pianos here." And I stopped everybody. And I said, we're not, but it's okay if people think we are. So it happened that the superintendent for the entire subdivision got word of that, and he came to me. I thought they were going to fire us. And he said, "I want you guys to build our next round of models." So we built 4 model homes that had never been built before. We were the least experienced framers, the smallest crew, had the least amount of equipment of anybody, but we built those 4 frames. And at the end of it, I realized I had netted $980. And so I knew that we needed to let somebody else do any production framing that was going to take place in that market, and we'd go do custom work. But I never forgot about the importance of how you do it. One other thing that Gene touched me with was his story about the excavators, and I'll close with this. I had a gentleman who did job site cleanup for us. One-man shop. His name was Jesus. Some of you have heard this story before. And even a quarter century later, it's still hard for me to tell. Jesus had moved to New Mexico from California, where he was a machinist. And he made a really good living there, but he was worried about the direction that his son was headed in because of the influences in the neighborhood and just the culture, and he wanted a simpler, little safer life for his family. So he moved to the Rio Grande Valley, and he couldn't make a living there as a machinist. The wages, the pay wasn't high enough at that scale. So he became an entrepreneur, and he bought this raggedy-ass old Ford truck, flatbed, and he went around and solicited work, cleaning up job sites and hauling away material. I want to tell you something. When Jesus cleaned up your job site, at the end of the day, you wanted to spread out a blanket and set a picnic. Because that's the amount of pride that he took in his work. We were well into a project, about to finish, and it was time to have some material cleaned up. And we had done everything that we could, by the way. We reduced 3 roll-offs down to 1 roll-off of waste from a large custom home. We did this by simply targeting certain materials that could be recycled, that were in demand, that we found other uses for, et cetera. And Jesus was very good about segregating and taking care of that, and I knew I could trust him with it. But the other thing about him, he was totally dependable. Absolutely. And so I had him scheduled to come on a Friday morning to clean up the job site. And we were working along, and he showed up on Thursday. And I didn't think too much about it at the time. He said, "Ron, do you mind if I do this today?" And I said, "No, go for it." So he went about his business, and a couple hours later, I could see he was getting close. And I want you to know, there were very few people that I worked with that I respected as much as I respected Jesus. And so I never let him leave the job site without a check. So I went to my pickup, and I pulled out the checkbook from under the seat, and I brought it over, and he came over. And I said, "Jesus, what owe you today?" And he said, $200. And I said, "Jesus, look at that load." And he said, "Okay, $300. So I wrote a check, gave it to him. I said, "Jesus, I'm just curious, how is it that you happen to be early?" And suddenly his face went down, his eyes went dark. And he said, "Well, I got a call from my family in Mexico. My father's dying." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, I have to drive down there." I said, "How far do you have to go?" He said, 1,200 miles. I said, "How are you getting there?" "Well, I'm going to drive." I said, "Jesus, what are you doing here?" He said, "Ron, I wouldn't leave without taking care of you first." What we're talking about here is quality of life in every sense. We were here for Consumer Electronics Show, and I talked to several manufacturers and vendors, and I proposed the idea to them. I said, you know, you're all selling the same thing. You're selling quality of life. And the perception of that quality is going to be up to each individual customer that you approach. But at the end of the day, that's what you're doing. It's about quality of life. I would suggest to you that if we all approached what we do and how we do it with the same intention to provide quality of life that Jesus provided, we would all be building pianos. So thank you all for spending this day here, your time, your resources. I hope that you have a marvelous 2020, and maybe we'll see you next year somewhere.